Hey everybody, I'm JC Pohl from Teen Truth here. Very excited to be working with you today with Dr. William Strixrud. He's one of the co-authors of just one of the most fabulous books I've ever read. It is the book, The Self-Driven Child. If you do not have this book, you definitely should pick it up. We've had the opportunity to, if you watched our video series, in part one of this video series, I worked with Ned Johnson, just to talk about conceptually what the self-driven child is about and what their work and everything they put in the book is really kind of trying to drive forward. And so Dr. Strixrud was kind enough to come on here and talk about some case studies. Like, I know many of you as principals and administrators and counselors and parents even that might be watching this video, you're dealing with all different types of students coming from all different types of life situations. And I thought that this Dr. Strixrud could just kind of give us some insight on how to work with these students and how to help them be self-driven as they work through life, as they work through school, and as they work through everything here at home. So say hello, Dr. Strixrud. It's good to have you here.
Really good to be here, JC. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, I'm super honored to have you here. So just give us a little bit about your background, just for the people that have not read the book or don't know your work. We'd love to just kind of let them learn a little bit about your story.
Sure. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, which means that I make a living by testing kids. And I have the last 37 years. I test kids if they're having learning problems or attention problems or emotional problems or social problems. And I try to figure out what's right and what's wrong and how to help them. And I also do some teaching at George Washington University School of Medicine and Children's Hospital here in DC. And I play in a rock and roll band. I've been meditating for 47 years, 2 children, 4 grandchildren. Yeah.
Very cool.
And also wrote this book with Ned Johnson. And we just finished our second book, which is coming out in August. What I'm excited about too.
Yeah. What's that book about?
Well, it's about talking with kids to build motivation and high stress tolerance, being able to function well under stressful situations, and a happy home. It's called "What Do You Say?" It's a lot of language about how do you talk with kids in an effective way. We think that communication with kids is really important at this time in our history, and so a lot of ideas from our own experience of years and years and years talking with kids. Some of the best ideas that we have about how to communicate effectively.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads us into a really nice conversation I was hoping to have here today with you. You know, one of the topics and themes that just shines through in your book, The Self-Driven Child, is just the I guess the issue or the dichotomy of internal versus external motivation for students. Can you kind of take us into that? I know in chapter 5 of the book you talk about it in depth, and I would love for our audience to learn a little bit more about just that internal versus external motivation that students have.
Right. So that people who study motivation kind of divide it into this internal or intrinsic and external motivation. And the internal, intrinsic, or autonomous motivation is where you're doing stuff because you want to. Either you love doing it or it's important to you. Nobody's making you do it. There's no reward. There's no punishment. And the external is more the traditional carrots and sticks, you know, where if you do this, I'll give you this. If you don't do this, there'll be this consequence. And I think there can be a place for both. But what we really want to nurture in young people is this internal or intrinsic motivation, that what we call self-drive, that self-driven quality, where what I want for kids is for them to spend most of their energy developing themselves so that they have something useful to offer this world, as opposed to just jumping through hoops that we set in front of them to either get through school or get into college. So it's how do you nurture that kind of internal drive for self-development that is the heart of this chapter and a big focus in our second book too.
Yeah. And so what are some of the things, like just practical tips to the teachers and administrators, as well as parents that might be watching? I mean, it is so easy for us, like even for me as parents, like I've read the book, I'm a counselor, like I know everything you guys are teaching, but still, even raising my kids, I end up putting that carrot out there in front of them, right? It's just, maybe it's what my parents did for me. So I'm just kind of like, what does that look like when you're trying to get a student to be motivated to maybe get a certain grade in class? Or I'm working with a student right now in therapy that he's trying to earn his cell phone back, right? And so how do you build that without it being that carrot out in front of him?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a very elegant theory of intrinsic motivation that we lean a lot on. It's called self-determination theory. And it holds that to have that intrinsic internal motivation, you have to meet three needs. And one is for a sense of relatedness or connectedness to your teacher or to your parents or to your tutors, something that kind of helps give you that energy to work. And so that it's relatedness. It's a sense of competence. I mean, you have to have some sense. You don't want to work hard on something you're just terrible at. You want to avoid it. So we want to promote competence and autonomy. The third one is autonomy. And we talked to the developers, one of the developers of self-determination theory, and said, we think that the autonomy may be the most important. What do you think? He said, absolutely. That sense of autonomy. And our feeling about motivation, our approach to motivation, is based in part, JC, on the idea that you can't make somebody do something against their will. And you can't make them want what they don't want. And you can't make them not want what they want. So we try to figure what can we do to get them to use their own energy to take their life where they want it to go. And so that's the challenge in the part that no amount, I mean, the research on this suggests that no amount of extrinsic motivation, no amounts of working to get rewards or working to avoid negative consequences morphs into that internal motivation. It's a different thing. And so we really, and you think about so many of the kids we know, some of the kids that I work with who have learning disabilities or ADHD, there's all, and the kids that my co-author Ned works with, who are these high achieving kids trying to get into elite colleges, that they're all kind of jumping through hoops. And we focus so much on competence, often at the expense of our relatedness and very much at the expense of autonomy.
So really what you're saying is like, it's not about jumping through hoops that we put out there for them. It's about them picking the hoop that they want to jump through.
Yeah. And so we think that there's a lot of ways to get at this. But I think that largely we keep our focus on that focusing on making sure that we have a relationship. And certainly in terms of helping kids be motivated, we can better help our kids find their own motivation if we have a good relationship with them, if we have a respectful relationship with them, if we aren't on them all the time, if we aren't criticizing or we aren't chronically disapproving of what they're doing if they aren't that motivated, chronically giving the message, you got to work harder, you got to work harder. If we focus on a relationship and a respectful relationship and accepting the kid where he is right now, and not fearing that somehow if he's not motivated now, he'll never be motivated. That's really important. That we wanted to do, kind of let our kids know as much as we can. We can see that they're competent in this area or that area. And as much as possible, we want to support their autonomy, in part through encouraging their own decision-making, and in part by respecting where they want to go. And what I spend a lot of time talking with kids about is, what do you want for yourself? You know, what are your goals? And would you like to work harder at this than you are? And then I'll brainstorm about ways that they can motivate themselves. But I think that there's all this evidence, JC, that rewards undermine intrinsic motivation. You got kids who like to do art. You start rewarding them from doing art, they don't want to do it anymore. People don't like to be controlled. And I think there's some place. I mean, there are kids who are terrified they have a lot of fears. Give them a reward for facing their fears. I think there's some short-term uses for it. Yeah. And for kids with ADHD, I think we can offer them. We can offer incentives in ways that don't undermine that autonomy by saying things like, don't do it for me, but if you want to work harder at this and you just can't make yourself, your brain just won't activate. You don't have enough dopamine in your frontal cortex to make yourself do this. Yeah. I'm willing to offer an incentive if it helps. I mean, there's ways that we can do that. So I'm not totally opposed. Yeah.
Right. So the incentive is still there, but it's really about the intrinsic value to wanting or motivation.
Yeah. It's about promoting your goals and recognizing there's some of this stuff that's boring and you just can't make yourself do it.
What can you geek out a little bit for us? Like, what's the brain science behind some of this? I mean, that's just so interesting. Yeah,
I think probably the most relevant thing is that when you're in a really motivated state, you have a lot of the neurotransmitter dopamine, particularly in your prefrontal cortex. It's making this is interesting, this is interesting, and dopamine is the neurotransmitter of drive. We mentioned in the book the study of dogs on this side of the fence and this side of the fence, or they're this side of the fence. Here's the fence. there's steak on this side, there's kibble on this side. And dogs with high dopamine levels, they'll jump over the fence to eat the steak. Low dopamine levels, the kibble's good enough. You know? And so that's basically, and we know that, for example, with ADHD, the reason that kids can't do their homework is that they tend to have low levels of baseline levels of dopamine, and they don't have enough dopamine to really get into their work, which is why rewards can be helpful in some respects. But we want to remember that more important than getting their work done, more important than getting good grades always, is having a clear model of who's responsible for what. And by that, one of the principles that we talk about in the book is don't work harder to help a kid improve his performance at anything, or do better in anything, or solve his own problems than the kid does, because we're going to weaken them. Because if we spend 75 units of energy trying to help a kid solve a problem, the kid will spend 25. And if we get more anxious and go up to 85, the kid will spend 15. So that we want to be sure that we're respectful of the kid, that we aren't trying to do a power play.
They'll eat the kibble. And so what we should focus on is like getting them some purpose and passion that they find their own fence that they want to jump over for the steak.
Yeah, I went to a school meeting a couple of years before COVID, JC, on an 8th grade boy who I just tested, who had language disorder and ADHD and learning disabilities. And he was in a Catholic school, and they're applying out to Catholic high schools. And he had like low C's and everything. And I went to this meeting, and one of the learning specialists in the school said it takes 2 learning specialists and a tutor and the mom on top of this kid all the time to get him to do any work. Mm-hmm. And I said, stop immediately. The more you do for him, the more he gets to avoid having to wrestle with his own issues here. Mm-hmm. I said, tell him, we love you too much to fight with you about your schoolwork, and we love you too much to work harder than you do. Mm-hmm. And thank God that these people, they're really good educators, and they said, they gave him that message. And over a year's time, this kid really transformed. And I talked to his mother about a little bit over a year later, and he was a different kid. but he was so demoralized. And so I think that certainly one of the takeaway points is don't work harder to help a kid help himself than the kid works, because we'll weaken them. We're going to undermine that intrinsic motivation, that undermine that sense that ultimately they're responsible for their own life. And I say that not like this is your life, this is your problem, buddy. More, but it's out of respect for them, out of love for them.
And to use some of the wording that you use in the book, it's like they're in control of their own. They're in control, really.
Well, thank you, JC. I mean, certainly the major thesis of the self-driven child is that having a sense of control over your own life is so good for you. It's all good for everybody, but it's really good for young people. And part of the reason we got to that was that a sense of control is crucial for mental health. Mm-hmm. I mean, you think about it, when you're anxious, your thinking's out of control. If you're depressed, forget it. You have no sense of control. It's hugely important for mental health. But also, every place we looked to try to understand how do kids develop that self-drive, all the arrows point in the direction of autonomy, that sense of control. This is my life.
That's the fertile ground to kind of build the self-driven child. Okay.
Completely.
Heck yeah. Well, this is just such great content. I'm sure our audience is just soaking it up. So we're going to dive in. The reason I wanted to focus on chapter 5 with you is you both did a really great job just kind of laying out different types of students that I know that us as parents, teachers, administrators, counselors, we've all worked with. So I'm going to go through 4 of them. I'd love for you to just give me just 2 or 3 minutes on each one, explaining kind of what's going on for them, but how you help kind of build that internal drive. And so the first one that y'all laid out was the saboteur. And it sounded like to me like that was the kid that, like, they have some motivation, but they're just kind of always making excuses and kind of cutting themselves down. So tell us a little bit about that student.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of kids that I see, they want to do well, they just can't make themselves do it. And many of these kids tend to have low levels of low baseline levels of dopamine. And certainly, many of these kids in the saboteur category have ADHD. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is that no amount of mental effort, no amount of willpower can overcome a low dopamine level. Mm. So, what we suggest is that for certainly kids with ADHD, we recommend treating ADHD as best we can.
Mhm.
But also we think about other ways to increase dopamine in these kids. And certainly one is focusing on really picking a big emphasis on the stuff that they love to do. Because when they're engaged in something that they're really passionate about, that creates high dopamine levels. And I think that they do sculpt a brain that can eventually go pedal to the metal. And so I think that, and go ahead.
I remember that was something I took away from the book when I was reading it. It was almost like you guys were saying, like, we don't care what you want to learn, as long as you want to learn something. Like, we want to build that energy. Like, we want you to be a learner. And if you want to learn about, Pokemon, like we want you to like get some of that momentum and kind of get those muscles built up is what.
Well, yeah. And I think that there's a guy named Reed Larson who studies adolescent development. And he studied years ago, he concluded that the way children turn into self-motivated adolescents and adults, he said it's not through dutifully doing their homework every night. It's through what he called the passionate pursuit of pastimes. It's when kids are really deeply involved in video. He said years ago, video games probably don't count. And we could have that conversation. But for me, if a kid is involved and really works hard to get better in sports or music or art or dance or rock climbing or coding, there's something that they're working hard. They're experiencing that flow state of deep involvement where the brain is highly focused, lots of energy, lots of determination, but low stress. And when I work with tons of underachievers, and one of the things I say to them is if they work hard at something, to get better and better and better in besides video games, I said, I don't worry about you because I know you're sculpting a brain that's going to be able to go pedal to the metal if you decide that school is more important to you.
When the time comes.
So I think with those kids who just can't make themselves, we want to say, would you like to work harder than you do? And then we brainstorm with them. We have ideas in the book about using physical exercise, for example. And certainly just for a lot of kids, just putting just getting more blood flow to the frontal cortex, doing ragdoll, putting their head below their knees, gets more blood flow. There's things like that. Just doing 20 push-ups before they sit down to work can help kids basically get mentally activated. So those are some of the ideas for that saboteur.
Yeah, and it kind of runs into the next one that I was going to plan to talk about is the enthusiast. And that sounded like a student like we're kind of talking about here. Like they have some momentum. Like even another therapy client I'm thinking of that I work with, like you tell him anything on the basketball court, he is in. He will do the extra work. He'll shoot the extra baskets. Like he'll take the ball when time's running out. He wants it in his hands. Yet in school, he struggles to have any of that type of motivation with his academics and his coursework.
Right.
So what do we as parents and educators kind of do for that student?
So again, what I say to those kind of kids is I'm not worried about you. As long as your brain is having that experience of being deeply involved, you're working really hard to get better and better and better and better at something that's important to you. I'm not worried about you. But then I'll talk with them to try to help them understand, to help see school in a different light. And for example, a lot of kids like those, I'll say, but when do you feel the happiest? When I'm talking with my friends. And what I tell these kids is that I think that if you're really a sociable person and you love to talk with your friends and they love to talk with you, there's a good chance that you're going to make a living talking with people in a skillful way. And here's what I want you to know. The professions, almost all the professions that require where you make a living by talking with people in a skillful way, they require a master's degree and sometimes more. So I think I want you to think about rethinking school, because I think that if you want to talk with people for a living, that you got to work hard at the school piece. Yeah. And so I try to make it see that school is something that we're not laying on. You need to do this. You need to do this. But trying to help them see that it's something that would be in the service of their own goals.
It's really a tool to help them get to their goal and where they want to be.
Right. I mean, so often we try to use fear to motivate kids, and this kid I was telling you about, this Catholic school. That the principal said, I keep telling him how important this is. He's got to turn this around. And this kid is completely panicked and discouraged. And I said, I think we can motivate him more if we tell him it really doesn't make very much difference where you go to high school. It's not that big a deal. So you don't worry, you have to turn this around immediately. And let's take some of the pressure off.
Yeah.
And I think because fear is a very good short-term motivator. If I would tell you, I'm going to burn down your house, but it's a terrible long-term motivator because people burn out.
Yeah.
And so I think we want to avoid with those kind of, tell them how, lecturing about how important school, you'll never be able to do this, and focus on really put a lot of energy in the things that are important. And then over time, help them to see that if they want to play, they want to get a scholarship in basketball, they got to work harder, or if they want to make a living, as I was saying, it's interpersonal. You need an education for that.
Yeah.
And so you may want to think about working a little harder.
And that way they feel in control. Well, if I want to get there, well, maybe he's right. X, Y, and Z will help me get there. So now I have a little bit of agency and ownership in that. And so now let's flip the equation, because one of my favorite characters you laid out in the book, I worked on the Harry Potter films, by the way. I worked on Goblet of Fire. It was one of the programs I worked on when I was at Warner Brothers.
Whoa.
Yeah, so Hermione Granger, when I saw it in the book, I was like, boom. And Hermione Granger is a student that I run into a lot with our work with Teen Truth. We visit all types of schools across the country, but every now and then we'll get into these high-performing schools where it's just like, man, you can just like smell the stress when you get in the room with the kids, right? It is, like you said in the book, it's Yale or bust, Stanford or bust. If I don't get X, Y, and Z, I will fail. And one of people I really look up to is Malcolm Gladwell. And I know in the book you mentioned David and Goliath, the book, which besides this book right here, David and Goliath is probably like one of my second favorite books. And
I'm honored to be in that company.
Heck yeah. And in his book, he really laid out just this idea that there are many different pathways to success. And so when you're working with Hermione Grangers or us here on campus or in therapy practices, or even parents at home that are working with these kids that are just like super stressed and super ramped, what are some things that we can do to help them still find success, but of course to pull back on some of the stress that they're going through?
Yeah. And one of the things I think I can be most helpful, I think, if I mention one thing from our new book, which is we have a chapter in our new book that's coming out in August on expectations and how we communicate healthy expectations to kids. And we talk about perfectionism. And it turns out that there's a very significant difference between the pursuit of excellence and perfectionism. And so with kids who are not perfectionistic, but are just are working 15 hours a day trying to get into Yale, what we want to do is it doesn't help. It's not very helpful to try to lecture kids about anything, about how that they know that sleep is important, that they know their relationships are important. So what I try to do is I try to say, how's your life working? Are you happy with the way you work right now? And one of the words that I use a lot is sustainable. I said, is this approach going to be sustainable? Let's say you work your butt off and you continue this kind of approach for the next 4 years, and you get into the college of your dreams. And could you keep it up for another 4 years? It's not like college is tons easier than high school. And I said, so I'm just wondering. And in our new book, we have a lot of this kind of language. I'm just wondering, or for whatever it's worth, where it doesn't feel like we're lecturing, we're trying to lay stuff on kids. We're trying to get buy-in.
I wonder.
So saying, I'm wondering that if there's a way that we could think about arranging your schedule, so you have just a little bit more downtime, a little bit more time with your friends. It's to figure out how you can achieve at a high level, but not make yourself crazy. Mm-hmm. And also just not have to drop out of college for a year. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was lecturing in Houston to a very, very high achieving school. And I mentioned one of the most elite schools in Washington, D.C. I don't remember why I said it, but I mentioned the school in D.C. And one of the mothers at the lecture came up to me afterward and said, I'm a psychotherapist at the Menninger Clinic here, a very, very prestigious mental health clinic in Houston. She said, we know this independent school in DC very well because many of their students, they get into the most elite colleges, but they can't handle them emotionally. Mm-hmm. So they take a medical leave and they come here for therapy.
Wow.
And again, I don't try to use fear to scare kids by that. Let's think about making it sustainable. And with the perfectionistic kids, you can't take that away from me. I say, I'm not going to try to take this away from And I don't want you ever to give up that pursuit of excellence, that desire to be excellent. However, there's a really big difference between that healthy pursuit of excellence, where if you screw something up, that it motivates you to work harder. I got to figure out how to do that. But where perfectionism, you hide your mistakes.
Camera went off.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Yeah. You hide your mistakes. You torture yourself if it's not perfect. So what I want you to think about is, let's think about keeping that really healthy part of your desire to do well, and maybe cutting back a little bit on some of the self-torture or some of the extra pressure you lay on yourself. Mm-hmm. And also, I will say, JC, the other thing is the last 2 chapters in our book are devoted to giving kids a more accurate model of reality. So in contrast to it's Yale or McDonald's kind of thing.
Yeah.
So to understand that, I just, for whatever this is worth, I just want you to understand here that there's various ways to people, and just tell them stories. And most people's path to success isn't like this. It's like this, and like that. So those are some of my ideas for those Hermione Grangers.
Definitely. And I think Malcolm Gladwell, as well as you both did so well in your book, is just laying out that, there's a lot of statistical data and research now that there's no exact correlation between like the school you go to and the grade you get on a test versus like financial success, family success, life success, happiness down the road, right? And so it's really kind of pushing back a little bit on that narrative and letting these kids know that, hey, there's many ways that you can find success. And Gladwell does a good job in his book, just kind of saying, I think there's a story in the book where he talks about like someone who wanted to be an engineer. And so they did everything they could to like get to MIT. And then once they got there, they like burned out, like you said. And Gladwell kind of makes the argument is like, well, they never became an engineer, but if they would have gone to like San Diego State or Texas A&M or whatever, like maybe in the end, they would end up becoming an engineer, which is what they wanted to do, And so
I know this idea that there's a theory in psychology called big fish, little pond theory. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that most people feel better about themselves if they're a big fish in a little pond. And so there are some people who will go to Yale and kind of rise to the challenge, and other kids at the bottom of the class at Yale, they feel like they're an idiot, Mm-hmm. And you look at the mental health, part of what I help kids understand too, these really high achieving kids, is that the incredible mental health crisis in college, including all the elite schools. I mean, these elite schools, 60% of the kids, this is before COVID, are seeking mental health services.
Yeah, for sure.
And I asked this group of kids actually in Texas, these student government kids in an elite independent school in Texas. I said, how many of you want to be happy as adults? And they all kind of sheeped that kind of they raised their hand. And I said, what do adults tell you about what it takes to be happy as an adult? And this one kid said, well, we understand that if you get into an elite enough college, a good enough college, everything's set. And there's nothing that's farther from the truth. As you said, all the research suggests it really just doesn't make very much difference where you go to college. It's much more important who you marry, who you decide to spend your life with, than where you go to college.
Yeah, or in the book, you even mentioned like finding a mentor or finding the internship, right? Like just the experience you have. Those kind of relates to success. So, Dr. Strixrud, I think you've just dropped value bombs here for our audience, and I hope that they listen to this. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to it over and over. Just so much great information from the Self-Driven Child, the book. So we're going to go ahead and cut the interview here. You can find more at teentruth.net if you want to learn more about our program. We're all about this idea and kind of empowering student voice on campus. But if you want to come back for a short bonus video, Dr. Strixrud has agreed to sit with me and just talk a little bit about screens, students dealing with screens and kind of how that plays into the whole conversation we had today, as well as some of the cultural and ethnic conversation, socio-economic conversation that we've been having here in America lately, and how that kind of plays into this conversation. So if you want to learn more, check us out in the bonus video. If not, you take care. We'll see you soon.